Hey, Milena Pastore, and welcome to the Tick Bootcamp podcast.
Hi there. So nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
It is really exciting to be here with you today, and I'm also excited to introduce to our folks, or reintroduce to our folks, my co-host today, which is Georgia Wood, who is originally from Australia, and she is now agreeing to serve as a co-host with me today. So, Georgia, say hi to the folks.
Hi guys, good to be on here again. I'm very grateful to be asked and very excited to hear your story.
All right, so we are going to have our international conversation today, focusing on Milena's Lyme disease journey. So why don't you folks sit back, and we're going to now introduce you to Milena, and she's going to talk to us about currently where she's living and talk to us a little bit about where she grew up. So why don't you start with that, Milena?
All right. Well, I'm currently living in Loveland, Colorado, and that's south of Fort Collins, north of Denver. And I grew up in Colorado in the southern part in a beautiful, vast alpine desert valley called the San Luis Valley. And from there, I went to school in Fort Collins at Colorado State. And as soon as I graduated, I zipped off to New York and lived in New York City, Brooklyn for 5 years, then Lower Manhattan for another 5 years before returning to Colorado again in 2016.
All right. So I guess like the first thing that sort of comes to mind for me is wondering what it was like to be an Italian kid in Colorado. Were you like the only Italian family in Colorado, and did you have to come to New York to find your people, or were there others?
I know, right? I get asked that a lot, actually, especially when I relocated to New York. It came up. My father's family were Italian immigrants. They settled in Boulder in an area called Sunshine Canyon with a few other Italian families, and kind of made this little community there. But of course, I grew up several hours away from Boulder. So there were a few other kids in my school, that had Italian heritage, but definitely when I got to New York, I was with my peeps. And, when I was living in Lower Manhattan, I was basically right in Little Italy. I lived in Nolita, which means north of Little Italy. So that was wonderful. Yeah.
So talk to us about what it was like growing up in Colorado, not just as an Italian American, but as a kid growing up. What were you dreaming about? What did you think your calling was from the kinds of things you enjoyed doing during your childhood?
Yeah, I probably always was jumping from one thing to the next in terms of my dreams. For a period of time, I wanted to be a veterinarian, but then I realized that I couldn't handle the pain and suffering. I was too compassionate and empathic of a person. So, and then at one point I thought I'd forever be a horse trainer because I grew up riding horses and just couldn't imagine doing anything else. But by the time I got to college, I decided I was going to pursue a career in marketing and public relations. So that's what I did for a period of time. But I will back up to, growing up in Colorado and what that was like, because that was part of your question. I grew up in a small town. It's hovered around a population of 5,000 for forever. Even to this day, it hasn't really grown much. But, it was very safe. My parents could drop me off in town and let me rollerblade and go to the pool and just, have a fairly carefree upbringing. As I mentioned, I was lucky to be able to ride horses because it was in a rural area of Colorado, so possible to have a little bit of space and land to raise horses. And I was involved in 4-H. And in terms of like school, I really loved being an active student. I got really involved in science fair and just was always pursuing different activities through school. And over time, I just developed a bunch of different skills. And in college, I was working for the radio station, and I was DJing at night. And, then I had also my little side gigs, like working at shoe stores and things like that. But by the time I graduated college, I was really eager and hungry to pursue an exciting career in New York City. And I was extremely fortunate because the first job that I landed was one at Condé Nast. So, I kind of went from like being in this little rural town to going to a bigger college and kind of a bigger community and having that exposure, and then ending up in New York City working at, in 4 Times Square with all this hustle and bustle and excitement. So it's been a really, really interesting journey so far.
So Milena, in any environment you find yourself in, there are going to be dangers, right? And one of the things you talked about was how lucky you were to grow up in a very safe environment where your parents could just drop you off out of the car and let you rollerblade to a particular location. And of course, that's something we New Yorkers would never do with our children, right? Because there are different types of risks that we have here. But I think one of the risks that we have in common, certainly, I live on Long Island, and I grew up on Long Island. Despite being born in New York City, I did grow up, in suburbia. We all had ticks as part of our experience, certainly those of us who grew up in rural environments. And one of the things that was starting to cause me to cringe as you were sharing with me some of what your desires were or some of your experiences were, is that we know that veterinarians actually have the greatest risk of contracting Lyme disease because of all of the contact that they have with the animal population, right? We know from this podcast that many of our past guests contracted Lyme disease because of their passion for equestrian sports, right? That there are a lot of ticks on horses, and equestrian athletes often find themselves contracting Lyme disease. So talk to us about, not, you already shared with us that at least as it related to human threats, there were very few in Colorado where you grew up, but of course, ticks and tick diseases were a real threat. And were you prepared for that, either during the course of the time that you were engaging in your equestrian activities, or when you were preparing for a potential career as a veterinarian?
Yeah, I remember when I was educated about ticks and Lyme disease, I mentioned that I was big into 4-H, which is big in rural communities. And every year I would go to something called the conservation camp, where you go for a few days to this little lodging, like little cabin community where you hang out with other kids and learn about nature and all these different things. And I remember learning about ticks and the fact that they carried Lyme disease, and it wasn't something you wanted to get. It could make you very sick. And so in my mind, I always associated ticks to be with the forest and with like the mountains. I had no clue that they were in the grass. And so actually, when I relocated to the East Coast and was going on hikes and going to the beach and, gallivanting through the grass, I really had no idea that I was even at risk, because in my head, I was not in an ecosystem that was, going to have ticks. And I also never knew how small that they could be. And I never knew that they also carried many other diseases besides Lyme disease. And of course, here in Colorado, although there are risks, and yes, it is to a lower extent than the East Coast. Unfortunately, people kind of perceive ticks and kind of live, and recreate without much concern, because there's a belief that really nothing out here exists and that getting bit by a tick is not of any concern. And so, in my experience, I was bit by a tick at quite a young age, but I didn't even know that had been a tick, because in my mind, I remembered it as being an earwig. And I had other people in my family tell me that earwigs do attach. And it wasn't until 2020 that I was sitting outside and this little earwig crawled up my leg and pinched me, and it fell right off my leg. And in that moment, I thought, that was not an earwig that bit me all those years ago. And I don't know if it was an adult that told me it was an earwig or if that was just the way that my mind remembered it, because I have a very vivid memory and I still have a scar right here to this day where
Where you were bit by the tick.
where I was bitten. Yes. And it was in Boulder, Colorado. And I was playing in my grandmother's yard where we would run in the grass and, climb trees and all this. And there was a bug on me that I couldn't wipe off, and I remember starting to panic. And I remember all my cousins gathering around me as my grandmother took out tweezers and a match, which the old school way of doing things, which we now know is not the good way to do it. So it wasn't until all those years later that I realized that that was my first and only known tick bite. I could have been bit on the East Coast unknowingly, and I do have some memories of some things that could be potential, moments where I got rebitten out there. But it wasn't until all that time later that I realized what had happened, because that, and we'll speak more about epiphanies, but that was when the epiphanies, as you go through this journey, you have all these moments where you have lots of epiphanies like downloading. And because at that time, that's when I started developing these super debilitating migraines, the type that make you blind, vomit, you can't stand, your head feels like it's in a vice. Like I remember wishing for death as like a 5 and 6 year old. And I remember getting sick during, at school. And I remember getting sick on family vacations. Like we were at Disney World and I got a really terrible migraine and my parents had to come back from an activity they were supposed to be doing to like rescue me. And yeah, so, just lots of epiphanies. And at that point, it's impossible to say if that's when I contracted Lyme specifically, but I did contract something, like no doubt. My life started changing dramatically after that.
Okay, and we're gonna build out the Lyme piece of this and what it means to contract Lyme and how our body harbors this and our immune system can manage it. Well, let's walk it back a little bit to 4-H, right? Because we here in New York do not have 4-H. I don't know what 4-H is. I've heard about 4-H, but what I think is really cool about 4-H is it is an educational program, right? And we largely find 4-H in rural communities. And you did receive at least an awareness of ticks and tick diseases from 4-H. And the reason I want to focus on this is there is a huge difference between awareness and actionable awareness, right? So you were in a program that was teaching you about agriculture. You were in a program where they introduced you to ticks, and you're in a program where they let you know that this was something that you should be aware of, but it wasn't actionable to you, right? I mean, you didn't have at that point an epiphany about a prior tick bite. And then when you left the Colorado frying pan and you came to the New York fire, where we have ticks everywhere, despite having the educational information you had, you didn't have the ability to protect yourself from being reinfected.
Right. Yeah, there is very little knowledge about what to do properly. There was, especially when it comes to prevention, just the importance of using prevention and doing very thorough tick checks, what to do if bitten, what to do if you start to get sick. And out in New York, it wasn't a topic of conversation amongst my friends when we would go on hikes, go to the beach, go camping. I was more concerned for my dogs than I was for myself. And I was applying things incorrectly. Like I remember I was going to hop the train to somewhere upstate. My mind, sometimes things blur together, but I was headed somewhere upstate, probably like Bear Mountain or something like that. And I was applying the tick prevention to my dogs on the way there. And that really wasn't going to be very helpful because it needed to be applied at least 2 days in advance, so and that was like, if I was actually trying to do something at all. A lot of times I think I went out with completely no protection, not not realizing it's just crazy because you say I relocated to the fire of New York, but it was like this fire is burning all around us and no one's talking about it, you know?
And Milena, one of the things that, I found so surprising as someone who grew up on Long Island, and by the way, I have a very aggressive Italian American mother who made us check ourselves every single day when we went from the outside, when we came into our house. I literally wasn't allowed in the house until I checked myself for ticks. I mean, but we were really in the throes of it. And I've shared with folks on this podcast in the past, and our listeners on the podcast, in our mudroom, which is the only room we could enter the house from, there was a vat of Vaseline, a tweezers in the Vaseline, matches, because like your grandmother, my mother would of course burn the tick, but not on us, thankfully. What she would do, she'd pull the tick off of us and then wrap it in paper and then burn it, because we were led to believe that the only way that you could kill a tick is by burning it. But I know there are a lot of folks who have been on this podcast and that their family members would actually light the tick while it was on them as a way of sort of backing up. But the wives' tale that we were taught was that if you put Vaseline on the tick would back out, and that would be easier for you to remove the tick. And of course, that's not true. We're just giving the tick more time on us to spit more nasty germs in us. But that's what we were told would happen with the Vaseline, right? So we all had these little techniques that that we were taught that unfortunately were not helpful. But at least from my cultural experience growing up, we were very tick aware, and we were always checking for ticks. So I found many, many, many ticks on me. My siblings found many, many ticks on them. We found a gazillion ticks on our dogs because we were constantly checking, and as a result, it was less likely that we were going to get sick because we were always checking, right? So because Lyme disease is a disease of exposure, and in most cases it's because of a tick bite. There are other ways, and we'll talk more about that as well, that tick diseases can be transmitted. But in your case, you were bitten as a 5-year-old, and you had a lot of symptomology that I'm sure you now know from, you've already shared, you've had these epiphanies, whereas you've now gone through your memory bank, and as you've looked at these experiences, migraines are very, very common in the Lyme community, and you were having migraines which were triggered shortly after your tick bite, and you had them for many, many years without it ever having been diagnosed as Lyme disease.
Right.
So talk to us about how your health sort of pivoted during your childhood to the time when you went to college. It sounds like you had your ups and downs from the standpoint of physical and emotional health. And distinguish those two for us. What kinds of mental health challenges were you dealing with during your childhood? And what kinds of physical health challenges were you dealing with during your childhood up till the time you went to college?
Yeah. So in terms of, like, I'd say one of the more difficult symptoms to deal with through my adolescence into my young adulthood was the neurological and cognitive stuff. Just being like on the verge or on the edge of having a migraine at any moment, like anything could push me into a migraine, and just trying to use what little information was available at the time on how to prevent migraines and how to treat them. And at that time, there really wasn't the really good, effective migraine medication. You could just treat the symptoms or just get through it, just survive through it, really. So that was difficult, with school. And like, as I mentioned, I was very, very active. So like when I would do science fair, it would be stressful because I could possibly get a migraine and it would like make me incapable of participating in the science fair, which was like really important to me. And same thing with like all the sports and everything like that. But my physical health was a little bit more manageable at that time. I was going through what I would just say is like strange things, like weird bouts of fatigue, complaining of not feeling well, but not really understanding how to articulate it. And then my emotional health and mental health, I started to deal with things like probably starting my freshman or sophomore year of high school. And that's when I just started to experience like anxiety, depression, just feelings of like overwhelm. And sadly, that really continued to spiral, as time went on. And I never really got the right help for that. So that component of everything got quite bad. And that probably got really bad before my physical health got bad later on. Yeah.
So give us some more details about the emotional challenges that you were trying to manage. You said you had anxiety. What did the anxiety look like? Meaning, did the voice in your head constantly, say things to you that caused you to believe that you were going to be in a threatening environment? What did the depression look like? And how was your family reacting to your emotional challenges? Meaning, were they giving you help, or were they just trying to just help you through it?
Yeah, I think through the years, I didn't mention much to my family. I, for different reasons, some which I'm aware of and some which I'm unaware of still, because I'm still always figuring things out and like understanding myself and my journey. But it wasn't until much later, when things got to a pretty critical point, that my family became aware of what I had been dealing with. So it was really something I kept to myself, because I think when I had tried to open up about it to different people, like maybe a friend or something like that, it didn't go very well. And I ended up feeling worse. I regretted opening up about it. So then I think I just chose to keep it to myself. And it is something that can be very difficult to articulate. So there's that part of it too. And of course, if people haven't been through it, it's hard for them to understand it also. So there's all these reasons that go into why you choose to keep these things more to yourself. But
And
I think,
were there any cultural issues? Any familial cultural issues? So, for example, again, as an Italian American, I can tell you that that therapy was not a part of our culture. It was not something that was offered to people who were either anxious or depressed. And in fact, even when my grandmother passed away, we tried to encourage my mother to seek therapeutic intervention, and she's like, "I'm Italian. We're not crazy. We don't do those kinds of things." So was there a cultural overlay for you as well, or was it just purely your decision to sort of suffer in silence because you didn't want to stress anyone else out?
right. I think it wasn't so much of a cultural influence on my family per se, even though, my family isn't an emotional type of family. But there's definitely not any negative stigma about these things. Like, my family is very understanding of what needs to be done in order to work through things. But I would say maybe it was just more society at large. And also just kind of feeling like this was something that once you share it, you can't go back, and unfortunately, we live in a world where you get labeled with things. And, mental health has really transformed and evolved, and it's much more open and accepting currently. And I think a lot really happened in the past, say, 5 years, especially. And back at this time, it just still wasn't something you could really safely open up about. And yeah, I honestly, I really will need to sit and think about, like, what are the reasons I kept it to myself so much, because I realize that I still don't fully understand that. But probably part of it was shame, a lot of shame. Yeah.
So let's talk about anxiety, because I want to challenge you on one of the things that you said, which is that that if you haven't had it, you don't understand it. And I'd argue that every single human being is anxious. Every single human being has had to manage anxiety. But let's first define anxiety. One of the one of the personal development folks that I've studied argues that anxiety is suffering in the present for a future imagined event, and that our brain is a binary brain that has survival software and our mind is just constantly looking for threats. And what happens is, when we are not aware of the way our brain works, our brain is going to be looking for threats, and if it can't find threats, it will imagine threats, and that's what will cause us to be anxious. Do you accept that definition, that anxiety is suffering in the present for a future imagined event that's triggered by our survival software, or would you define it differently?
I believe that's one part of anxiety, one manifestation of it, or one root cause of it. Yes, anxiety can be very, very attached to our thoughts, which I'll get maybe a little bit more to that in a second. But one thing I was really noticing with myself is that I was experiencing anxiety, like sensations of anxiety, increased heart rate, sweating, nervousness, even when I didn't have any thoughts happening that were related to it. And the best way I could describe it is if you drank way too much coffee. Even a very healthy-minded individual with very healthy mental health, if they drink too much coffee, it can trigger anxiety. And then if they attach a thought to that, then it can manifest into almost a panic attack, because you've got these two things interacting. And unfortunately, throughout my life, I had a lot of material to give the anxiety. So I would often have, go down spirals where a thought or thoughts could be attached to it. But I was also experiencing what I would just describe as a physiological anxiety, where chemistry was changing in my body for seemingly no reason, or just out of my control, waking up in the middle of the night with your adrenaline just pumping crazy, or having really intense panic attacks while you're sitting at your desk at work. And granted, I was pretty much always in a job where I had a very fast pace, a lot of responsibility, a lot of pressure. New York is a very high pressure environment. So all these things combining is, and I didn't have the resources to help myself. I was doing my best, but as we know, it kind of takes extra effort and trying some different things. And I was still very much focused on work and just, we live in a world where we're just, with any issue you deal with, there's this quick fix so that we can stay working, whether it's painkillers, coffee, alcohol, whatever it could be. And I was losing the ability to figure things out, and it was kind of this slow deterioration over time until I sort of just bottomed out.
If it's okay, I'll come in there, because it really is that gliding through life, and especially, and I think we'll get more into this, but I know you must be living in your 20s around New York City life. So I'm guessing and that really is, I believe, so much of that. Everyone just hustle, 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 and then you can relax when you get a bit older and get that steady job or steady income and have everything done. It's fine if you're just hustling through your 20s, but when you're dealing something like you and I have gone through, you can't. And then it's hard enough when you're healthy in your 20s, let alone when you've got a debilitating disease that people don't understand yet, professionals don't understand that, but mainly yourself doesn't understand. And you don't even know who you are as a person without a voice. So I give you so much credit, but seriously, just well done for even being able to go to office jobs and get through it and just survive through that, because it is not easy, and I give you so much credit.
Thank you, Georgia. It was very hard. It was a very harsh world, very cutthroat, just quite toxic, actually. And that did not bode well for me with what I was dealing with. And I did not have a support system. I did not have a support system anywhere. um, so, that's when I look back on things, and this is the help of friends who have helped to show me, like, I am strong. I think when you're going through this stuff and you're unraveling, like, a lot of people try to imply to you that you're weak, or that you're a hypochondriac, or just toughen up, this and that. And you wonder if they're right. You might even believe them that they're right. But if only they knew what you're dealing with, which they never can unless they go through it themselves. But it's like there's a lot of stuff that arises on this journey to make you doubt yourself, because it is not an easy journey. Nothing about illness is easy, but then you get an illness that's very controversial, that's very confusing, that affects you not only physically, but mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. It is a very, very difficult journey. And, that's why it's so important to just do our best to surround ourselves with the right people.
I do.
Right.
Sorry,
And
continue.
you mentioned that you too recently have found yourself surrounded by the right people.
And I think that's something we definitely talk about, because we can be our supporters for ourselves. And it sounds like you've got a little dog too.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that, I know for me, my little dog helped me. I'm wondering, does having that other support that started to get me on that route? And I'm asking, I guess, for you is, how did you first, I guess, reach out? Not reach out, that's not the right word. I do have brain fog right now as well, guys. But I guess, how is it where you started trusting those support systems? Because coming back to the anxiety and the depression, it definitely does help to have that outer, as you said, it was the friends around you. They were like, hang on, girl, you are strong. You were actually really, really strong. And you can say it as much as you want to yourself, but it also does, it's always nice to have someone tell you that and remind you that, especially with something like this. So I guess it's less of a question, but how would you suggest people to test how they trust those friends or relatives or whoever, doctors?
Yeah.
It's a tricky question.
It is. And, I have to be very honest that most of my journey was quite alone. It's only been recently that I have connected with healthy people who are capable of supporting me the way that I need to be supported. And, I've always had a lot of compassion for others, because, people need to try harder to get it.
I agree with that.
Right? They do. Like, there is some onus, but at the same time, it is a very difficult thing to understand. And quite frankly, not everybody has the skill, right?
Yeah.
Like, not everybody has what it takes to show up for people who are going through this very complex, bizarre, difficult thing.
And sorry for interrupting, but I do want to say, for everyone, write that down as a mantra, because really not everyone is capable, and that is okay. It doesn't make them a bad person. Doesn't mean they don't care about you. I really like how you just worded that. They may just not have the capability, and that is okay. Write that down and repeat that, because so many times you can so easily get broken down by that one comment. You're like, oh wait, no.
Right. And people can have the best intentions, and just what comes out of their mouth is just rubbish. But and that's why there's a lot of education, and it can be very exhausting. I remember when I was quite sick, just feeling so exhausted of having to explain things and almost argue with people. And I'm like, why am I arguing? Because I shouldn't have to do this. But in my life, in my journey, what I had to do, and I don't say this is the right thing for everybody, it's just was my circumstance. I just had to kind of like separate myself because
Yep.
a lot of people who stepped in to help me, unfortunately, they ended up causing more harm than good.
Yep.
And I just had to like protect myself, really. And that was just my circumstance. You know,
Yep.
that's just the way that's just the way timing worked for me. You know, I had just left one place and came to another. I didn't know many people. I don't have a large family, so you know, it's just the way it worked. And it just gave me a lot of time to figure things out. And it was not easy. And I had to figure out like creative solutions to things. And you know, it is nice that, especially similar to like the advances in mental health, and not only with the science and understanding and treatment of mental health, but just also in the acceptance of it and like the ability to be more open about it. A very similar thing has been happening with Lyme disease. You know, we still have so much work to do and so far to go so that everyone can get the proper diagnosis and treatment that they need. But it's been, you know, as my journey has progressed, I've had like more access to information and things, you know, like just the existence of this podcast and having, you know, these conversations, like opening it up and normalizing it and providing a resource and support for people who are going through this. Like at the very beginning of my journey, that kind of stuff didn't exist, you know, and it felt very bleak, and it was very difficult to connect with resources and find ways to like just get that emotional support, you know, and to cope with the isolation that comes
Yeah.
with the disease.
So,
Absolutely.
George, let me just walk us back.
Yeah.
So we have a context, right? Because
Absolutely.
we're
Absolutely.
we're on the phase of your journey, Milena, where you've had a childhood in Colorado where your physical health has had its ups and downs, but your immune system was managing it. You had some ups and downs with your emotional health, but you were largely managing that as well. Sometimes a little bit more quietly than maybe you wish you had, but you were able to manage that. You left Colorado. You came to New York, which is a very different culture, right? Where you have a very different paced experience, right? And of course, you're in fight or flight all the time, right? You know, one of the things we were beginning to explore was your anxiety, and part of what I'd like to just pause here for a second is to ask you: do you believe that your anxiety was triggered by your body's response to your then undiagnosed Lyme disease? Meaning, you had all these microbes attacking you, right? They were in your brain, they were in your body, they were attacking you physically, and as a result of your body being attacked by these microbes physically, you were triggered into the sympathetic expression of your nervous system, and that physiological anxiety, along with the emotionally triggered anxiety, put you in a position where you were just constantly in fight or flight. Which, you know, I'd argue to our community, that means you're either fighting, fleeing, freezing, fainting, or fawning. Those are the only 5 things you can do, in addition to being immunocompromised. And is that really where you were when you came to New York, and dealing with cultural changes, a very different pace in life, starting a new career, and then of course not being healthy because you had undiagnosed Lyme disease?
Right. Yes, I absolutely believe that my, you know, emotional, mental health, my anxiety, depression was caused by an underlying infection. And there is a correlation when I map it out. And in addition to the point in time when the mental health issues reached their peak is also when my physical health started to drastically change. And you know, I was trying medications for a period of time, and I do believe that people need to try whatever is available, and I support people in whatever choice they make with how they want to treat things. And, I decided to try medications. Unfortunately, they did not help me. They actually made my situation worse. I'm very sensitive to chemicals, so like my body didn't respond well to them. So it was like it compounded the problem instead of helping, because as we know now, if you treat certain types of anxiety with certain types of medications, it's not addressing the root cause. So in my situation, it actually made it worse. And then I had to deal with coming off of the medications, which was really brutal for me, a very brutal experience. And, as the mental health stuff started to get worse, I was starting to have like higher frequency of flu-like symptoms, constant swollen glands, really terrible sore throats that were not strep. It got to the point where I could barely make it into work, and I was calling out 2 or 3 times a week. Like, it just, and I would just come home, go straight to my bed, and could barely get out of bed the next day to make it into work. And making it through each day was just terrible. And I was taking handfuls of ibuprofen, like literally, it's amazing the damage I did to myself with that. I was drinking tons of coffee, like insane amounts of coffee, which, of course, these things were not helping me. They were compounding the situation and
Right.
making,
Exacerbating the fatigue.
right. So I now know that now, and to answer your question further, as I started to learn about the complexities of mental health, I started to, because for me, I got to this point where I was so suffering. The suffering had grown so intense that I just decided, like, I need to try everything I can to heal, to get better. Like, I need to really figure out what's going on. And I started to learn about all the different things that contribute to our mental health, our gut health, our environment, toxins, all these things. And that's kind of where I started with trying to figure things out. I switched my diet. I figured out all the foods that were bothering me, which were pretty much all foods, because by that point, my body was so inflamed and my gut was so damaged that on the food sensitivity test, pretty much every single food was an issue for me. And it was quite a journey, like as I began to make all these changes, I was so desperate. So I needed to see improvements with my health, and it just wasn't happening. Like, if anything, I was continuing to get worse, which was, very conflicting and very like disappointing for me. But somehow I just continued to not to say I didn't have moments of weakness, because I had some extreme moments of weakness. But I just kept focusing on figuring things out, just continuing to educate myself, which was hard because I couldn't really think straight. It was very hard to read. It was very hard to have conversations, to understand different concepts at times. But I was able to grasp on to just enough to keep going. And of course, probably when I had reached another really low point, is when more doors started to open for me, and I started to find more answers, which kind of kept propelling me forward into just maintaining hope and determination that I was going to get through it.
So let's, I want to ask you 2 more questions before I let Georgia take you through the diagnostic journey. How old were you when you finally were diagnosed with Lyme disease?
33.
So you had suffered almost 30 years before you were finally diagnosed with the disease.
Right. Especially starting around 25 is when things started to really get weird for me.
When was the first time you suspected or someone put on your radar that you were possibly suffering from Lyme disease prior to your diagnosis?
Because I was dealing with such high degrees of pain and fatigue and whatnot, I was starting to see these different practitioners to just cope with things and try to heal. So I was seeing a functional doctor who was helping me to heal my gut, and she referred me to a chiropractor. And the very, very first time I saw him, just based on what was going on with me physically, and I also opened up about the mental emotional stuff, he just very casually mentioned, "Oh, you remind me of my patients who have Lyme disease, but don't worry, it's not a big deal." He literally said that, "But don't worry, it's not a big deal."
So how old were
So,
you then? How long before you finally get your diagnosis was that window where somebody was essentially saying, which we hear on this podcast all the time, you sound very limey?
right, that was just a few months before I got or just a few weeks before I got the diagnosis.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was, I had relocated back to Colorado thinking that being here and just resting would just be all that I needed. I had made all these changes to my lifestyle, just really started to tap into like living a healthier life, more balanced. But I just kept getting worse and worse and worse. It was almost like the harder I tried, the worse I got. So it was in this journey because I finally started to prioritize my health and started to, see different specialists and whatnot. So I went right back to that functional doctor who was just about to run a panel of other tests on me and explained to her what he had mentioned. And she's like, "Oh, we'll tack on the Western blot." Well, there was two miracles there. It's like one that the chiropractor mentioned that because it's kind of a strange thing to mention to someone, and he could have thought it but not said it, but he chose to say it. And coincidentally, I was in a position where I could go get a test. The other coincidence is that the doctor it's very rare out here to have a doctor who even knows anything about Lyme, but her husband had been healing from Lyme. So she was familiar with the testing and all that sort of thing, even though it wasn't her area of expertise. So when the Western blot came back, according to the CDC, I wasn't positive, but she knew that there was those two bands that we all know now have the controversial bands of the IgG testing. So she knew by looking at my tests that I actually did have Lyme. And that was like the first moment that my head just started spinning because she said, "According to the CDC, you do not have Lyme disease, but you're going to have to start treatment." And I was like, "What does that mean?" Like, I just, and then of course, as we know, the journey begins and you start to understand why there's all these very weird, confusing, controversial topics along this whole journey.
Exactly where I wanted us to go now, right? Because this is all coming together for me to ask you one more question before Georgia takes you through the next phase of your journey, which is, how do you define Lyme disease? Or let me ask you the question differently. We here at Tick Boot Camp have had almost as many definitions for Lyme disease as we've had guests. Certainly the experts have had almost as many definitions. We actually have a definition that we're asking folks to explore with us. So we here at Tick Boot Camp believe that Lyme disease is a polymicrobial, multisystemic, chronic infectious disease. And I would argue that as you were going through describing your journey, that you are the very definition of the Tick Boot Camp, or maybe we should put your picture in the dictionary next to the Tick Boot Camp description of Lyme disease. But again, I don't want to charm you by saying that. I want your reaction. Do you believe that we are correct in describing Lyme disease as a polymicrobial, multisystemic, chronic infectious disease?
Yes. I think we could get really specific and we could say that it is only Borrelia burgdorferi. But we know now that there's multiple strains of the Lyme bacteria. And we know that there are also various other tick-borne diseases, which can often be umbrellaed or encompassed within Lyme. Each of them has unique characteristics. They've even discovered that very specific strains of Borrelia are more prone to making someone more prone to the mental, emotional.
Well, certainly. So really, so you may be agreeing or disagreeing with me, but so the CDC definition, of course, is Borrelia burgdorferi. That is Lyme disease, and it could be acute, and it could be chronic, and it could be, they have all these, all these other things. We're arguing absolutely not. It is never one bacteria. It is never one strain of one bacteria. It is polymicrobially, and you're right. Different symptoms certainly have been connected with current research to different strains of Borrelia, but then of course we have many other microbes such as Bartonella, right? And we talk about Bart rage and the impact that that's having, which is again a different bacteria, right? We have Ehrlichia, we have Anaplasma, and the list goes on, and we know that a tick could harbor as many as 200 different microbes, many of whom we haven't even identified. But so my question to you is, do you adopt the CDC definition, or do you like our definition better, that it's polymicrobial and not just one strain of one bacteria?
I adopt your version of that, and it's a very similar perspective that I have developed over time. And one thing I'll say quickly is that whether this name Lyme disease is going to evolve into something else, because things always evolve, right? Whether we just start calling it tick-borne illness, which is catching on more and more, vector-borne disease, this and that. Let me make sure I turn something off really quick. One reason it's important to kind of develop some sort of broad term that does encompass all of these polymicrobial manifestations, as you put it, is because the testing is so complex. And let's say someone gets bit by a tick and it happens to not carry Lyme, but it carries all these other things, like we still need to test for all of those other things. And the urgency to start treatment is very similar. The prevention is very similar. So I think that even just there's reasons to start looking at it differently in terms of the polymicrobial component, because there's so much weighing on that. That is very much related to the diagnostics and just better understanding how these microbes behave in general.
Let's talk about the multisystemic piece of it, because you described almost every part of your body, suffering from various symptoms at different stages. One of the reasons why doctors would often argue that people were not really physically sick but emotionally sick, because they had various symptoms at different times, right? And in your experience, you had very different symptoms. When you were a child, you had migraines, you had all kinds of other fatigue-related symptoms and other kinds of physical symptoms, right? That were developing over time, but not necessarily the same symptoms. So, do you believe that, based on your experience, that it is in fact, and you also shared with us, you had the emotional and the mental health components as well, not just the physiological components. So do you adopt our description of the definition of Lyme disease as multisystemic?
Absolutely. I think that it starts with immune issues and inflammation issues, and then those just cascade, affecting everything else. Like nearly every system of your body ends up affected in some shape or form. And you can experience a myriad of different symptoms, and some can come and go, some maybe come once and never come back again. And then, I think when a lot of people really get taken down is when all these symptoms are happening simultaneously, really intensely. And, it's like as though the physical and, pain, like as though the pain and the other physical types of symptoms aren't bad enough. On top of that, you're kind of losing your mind. And reality is not as you used to know it, or, the world becomes a very, very different place. And I would just say that I believe the mental, emotional symptoms, although the physical ones are terrible and agonizing, the mental, emotional can be really the worst, because it's just it's a very agonizing experience to go through, like the mental, emotional anguish that the disease literally causes. Like, even if you're not going through some sort of thing in your life, that's worth grieving, worth, that sort of thing, this disease makes you experience those feelings
Right,
because
so
of how it affects your nervous
Milena,
system and your brain.
do you believe that the disease, either in its manifestation physically or as the bugs are in your brain, are changing your neural pathways and changing the way that you think?
That's part of it for sure. There are, similar to it, everything changes our genetics, right? The food we eat, the environment we live in, our genetics change over time. Diseases change our genetics, and they change. A disease like Lyme disease changes our pathways, as you've mentioned. And there's also other things compounding it. You've got detox issues, like when our liver, spleen, kidneys, pancreas are overloaded with toxins, that makes you feel terrible too. And it can make you really irritable and have, mental, emotional stuff. So you've got all these layers of things.
For sure. So, I mean, so you all of your systems are breaking down, you're becoming toxic, and then ultimately we get to the last piece of our definition, which is chronic infectious disease, right? So it's a infectious disease that's causing your entire system to become toxic, and it ultimately overloads your immune system, which is why you become chronically ill, right? And that's what happened with you, right? I mean, you were becoming sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker. You're becoming more and more toxic. There were a number of different factors. What was making me anxious, and I think many of our listeners, as they were going on this journey with you, and as they are going on this journey with you, like when you were saying you were moving to New York City, I was wincing because, like, oh no, you went from like the clean environment of Colorado to the really, really toxic environment of New York City, where you have not just a fast pace, but you have all kinds of environmental toxins. It's a dirty place. It's a place full of microbes and, full of mold, and it's just like full of nasty people. And it's like, you just went from, really the frying pan to the fire, and your body was just becoming more and more toxic, and you went to a more toxic place, right? And that's why we don't call the acute manifestation Lyme disease. It's not Lyme disease in our view. It's only chronic illness that's Lyme disease. Now, right, we can make the argument, Milena, as some have, that we should divorce from Lyme disease, right? Dr. Alan McDonald, who's one of our mentors, has argued in both writing and on this podcast, we should be divorced from the term Lyme. And I think you were kind of making an argument earlier as well that we should be using a different term. My concern with that is that there's been a whole world built around that term, right? That is developed over the course of 50 years, where there are people who are describing their illness as Lyme disease. Millions of them. We have doctors who are Lyme specialists. We have organizations built around the word Lyme. Now, this podcast is not built around the word Lyme. We're Tick Boot Camp, but it's certainly the focus of our podcast. So I'm wondering, as a practical matter, do you think we can really divorce ourselves from the word Lyme disease, or should we just do the opposite, take control of the definition of the term, the way we are trying to do here at Tick Boot Camp, and perhaps using you as Exhibit A?
Ha, lucky me. Well, it's like if I could just look into my crystal ball, and it's always impossible to say how things are going to evolve, but I almost imagine that it might be necessary to start a different terminology. And there's another thing going into it, is that Lyme has almost become this dirty word. So if the term doesn't change, I would like to see a more acceptance of the word Lyme and Lyme disease. It's like saying you have Lyme disease is like looked down upon, and it's just like with a lot of other words and things that exist in our world, right? Like when they've been abused over time, they become like this dirty word. And so if the terminology doesn't change, I do hope that people don't wince or like go like this when,
Yeah,
when
no.
they find out that you have Lyme disease.
Milena, you're absolutely right, but it's not just people in the community, in the general community. It's people in the medical community that are wincing when you come in with a Lyme disease diagnosis, which is the bigger problem, right? So something has to change. I'm agnostic about treatment. I'm agnostic about what the approach is, but we have to change, right? And I'm going to continue to beat the drum on just taking control of the term. But if it turns out that we divorce from the term, I'm just as happy. I'm not personally invested in that. I just need to help folks understand that we need to change, right? So last thing I want to explore with you before Georgia takes you through the rest of your diagnostic and then the beginning of your treatment journey is that Phyllis Bedford, who is one of our guests in the past and the founder of the Limelight Foundation, argues that Lyme disease is the supermarket diagnosis disease. She says that more people are diagnosed in the supermarket when you walk up to them and you are describing your symptoms, just like you. I mean, you kind of had a supermarket diagnosis yourself. It was, a chiropractor sort of making a side observation. Hey, this sounds kind of Lyme. He didn't use those terms. You sound like Lyme disease, right? So it wasn't somebody really, although it was in a medical environment, it really was more of a social comment. And my argument is that the reason it is a disease that's more often diagnosed in the supermarket than it is in a doctor's office is because you all know what Lyme disease is. You know it is a polymicrobial multisystemic chronic infectious disease. So it's easy for you to see the symptoms and say, hey, you look like you have Lyme disease. Whereas doctors don't have a definition. They think it's one, it's one microbe causing one set of largely arthritic or rheumatological symptoms, and because they don't have a diagnosis, they don't have the ability to diagnose it, right? Because the prism through which they're looking at is limiting their ability to see what's right in front of them. Whereas those of you who've been on the journey see people with Lyme disease all the time, and you're telling everybody you have Lyme disease, and so more people are diagnosed by you in Georgia than by people with medical degrees, right? So tell me if you agree with that, and if you do, does that cause you to think maybe a little bit differently about maybe what we should be doing is taking control of the definition rather than trying to divorce from the term?
Well, I do sort of view them as two separate things. And like, I know myself, I've had several people in my life, whether they be friends, family, acquaintances, people I chat with in line at the store, who have gotten tested just to rule it out, which is such a tricky path to go down because testing is not great. So they could still be working to figure things out.
You're so polite. You are so polite. Testing sucks.
You said it there. You said it. But in terms of how that affects like diagnostics or just the supermarket diagnostic, is that what you're talking about? The term?
No, just diagnose. Look, it really needs to be, one of the things that the CDC does, they're all over the place, right? And we've been bouncing around the CDC together, right? Between, what their definition of bans are for you to be CDC positive, and whether or not it should be a test at diagnosis or a clinical diagnosis, whether it's one bacteria. I mean, the CDC is all over the place. I mean, they're just a mess, right? So, do we accept them? Do we not accept them? Are they right? Are they wrong? I mean, it's just a disaster, the CDC, right? So rather than sort of focusing on what they are using as definitions, let's just stay focused on what the community is doing, right? Because you in Georgia have a better capacity to diagnose people with Lyme disease because you've been on the journey and you know what it is. And that's why you're pointing it out to people in the supermarket, right? So, I'm arguing that if we can open up the prism through which medical professionals are looking at their patients, they're more likely to diagnose people with Lyme disease if they have a definition like the one that I'm arguing, rather than coming up with a whole new term and a whole new way of getting folks to think.
Yeah. I do agree that there needs to be a retraining. It needs to happen quickly. We need to move on from these really, grossly inaccurate diagnostic measures. And I am seeing the term like tick-borne illness or tick-borne disease or vector-borne disease more broadly used. But, you know, if everything were just to be encompassed under the term Lyme, I see really no issue with that. But as I just kind of feel that because it's the landscape is changing so drastically and we're learning so much that I just, I don't know what it is, but I have this feeling that the term just might evolve into something else on its own because it's just the way it's unfolding.
Okay, so you're being polite to me, and I appreciate that. So let's move forward, right? So, folks, we're now at the stage of Milena's journey where she's now back in Colorado. She left dirty, toxic New York City, and she's now back at home. And she's finally been diagnosed, although not CDC positive, still diagnosed with Lyme disease. And now George is going to take you through the rest of this portion of your journey where you're now treating for Lyme disease despite not being CDC positive.
Beautiful. Okay, good. I just need to make sure I was unmuted. So I guess my first question that comes up to me is when you moved back, you knew you did as again brain fog. You did know you had Lyme at that point, or that's when you got diagnosed when you were moving back to Colorado?
Things in New York were just getting really difficult for me.
Yeah.
And, it was becoming clear that I couldn't work anymore. And it just seemed like I just needed to take some time off. So it's like, oh, go back to Colorado, take some time, take a month or two, and you'll bounce right back. It took about a year and 3 months before I actually had my diagnosis after getting back to Colorado.
Yes, that's what I believe. My main question behind that was that there was another year of being out in the grass, being in that area you may have originally gotten that tick. There was maybe not the looking into is there mold in the house that you moved? Like, I guess that was my question behind it.
Right.
So then a year in, after you went to the chiropractor, you said it was just a couple of weeks after he had mentioned you got the diagnosis. What steps did you take after that? And like, what sort of path? Because there's so many elements, as we've talked about. It could be the dietary right away, or like the saunas, or it also comes in with, it sounded like you were having to call out of work. So how did you get that massive like news and then be like, right, I'm now going to try and process this and start on this trial error journey, is what I like to call it, because it is definitely the definition of trial and error.
Absolutely. Trial
with
error.
Growth.
Right.
With growth. Yes.
There's always that little whoop at the end.
You gotta do it.
Trial error, roller coaster, experiment. As I mentioned, my head just really spun when I had the diagnosis, because it was really difficult for me to understand how, like, I technically wasn't testing positive, but that I did have the disease. And of course, I better understand that now. But leading up to the diagnosis, I had started to really implement a lot of healing modalities into my life. So, I figured out my food issues. I changed my diet. I stopped using chemicals. I just prioritized, meditation and just healthy activities. I stopped consuming alcohol, all these things. And at that time, I had moved to a very moldy place. Fort Collins, Colorado had been flooded multiple times, and I was living in this area that's kind of down in this gulch surrounded by, it's like in a lower elevation. So it had been flooded multiple times. And I do also suspect that that's around that same time I contracted West Nile virus.
Okay.
I'll never know when that happened because I only got tested after the fact. I never knew when I had the acute infection based on testing, but that's what I suspect kind of like sent me over the edge of like no return. Because things were getting progressively worse, and then suddenly they just like dropped out from underneath of me.
If you
But
don't mind me asking, and you can definitely say it's too, like when you say dropped out, I know you also said you had quite a small support system, if anything, if anyone. Were you doing most of this research and self-healing, apart from the 1 or 2 doctors you're working with, pretty much by yourself?
yes,
Wow.
yes. And
Yeah.
the first couple of doctors that I worked with were willing to help me, and they had good ideas and whatnot, but neither of them were Lyme literate by any means. You know, the first one that I started with the actual treatment, like the antibiotic or like immunological treatment, had me do like some heavy duty rounds of doxycycline, but there were other components of the disease that she just didn't get. Like, I remember, you know, coming across a little, at that time, it was just a little tidbit of information that was like tuning into the mental, emotional issues of the disease. And it said that, you know, up to that point, it was believed that only strep could cause PANS or pandas, but they're now discovering that other infections are causing it as well. So I remember going to her with the article and saying, this is what's going on with me. This is what's going on with me. So she had me take a strep test, which came back negative. And she literally told me, no strep, no pandas, like emphatically. So, you know, they each kind of took me as far as they could, which wasn't far. I had like a major relapse after my first round of treatment. But to answer your question, I was going through it alone. I was driving myself to my appointments, you know, going through, sleeping all day to insomnia for days, and then, you know, just the differences in the sleep and the energy. And just, you know, where I had worked myself into, because as I was getting worse, I didn't know what was going on. So I think I developed a lot of self-blame. You know, I think I figured that whatever I was going through, I caused. I deserved it somehow. So because of that, you know, in this unfortunate way, I really closed myself off. In addition to the fact that not a lot of people in my life at the time were capable of stepping up to support me in the way that I needed. Thankfully, you know, I had support in terms of covering my living costs and paying for my doctor's bills. And you know, I didn't have uber fancy doctors, but as we know, this treatment's not covered by insurance. So a lot of it was out of pocket. And so there was ways that I was getting support, which I'm so grateful for. But yeah, you know, unfortunately, I was on my own, for different reasons. And one just being that it just was the better route for me to go.
No, absolutely. And I truly believe with everyone's Lyme journey, we all have things in common, but we also very much, all of us are so different. And I really do believe it is what's happening in your life. That does, because stress triggers mainly on sides. I definitely, after you've done that, you said you did the big dose of antibiotics and then it got really bad after that. What were your steps after that? Did you want to go back to the antibiotics and give it another round, or were you just like, I need to do the holistic side, or mix of both? Or what were your next steps after that kind of big doubt after?
Yeah. You know, the antibiotics ended up being pretty intense for me, like with like the die off and just, you know, the Herx reaction that you get from that. And then because I'm super sensitive to like pharmaceuticals and just also like the damage it did to my gut, it just seemed like, you know, to take a step back, like a lot of treatments can come with difficult side effects. And that's sometimes just the way it is. Like even the most natural, you know, options can come with some difficult things, because cleaning this stuff up and treating it isn't pretty. It's an ugly job. So you're going to go through some stuff, but I did feel that just the other things that were caused by the antibiotics weren't worth it to me. So I did decide to start to pursue other things. I began to study the work of Stephen Herod Buhner and incorporated a lot of herbs and those sorts of remedies into my regimen. And I also
You have sorry for interrupting, but do you have a top couple of herbs that really speak to you that have worked for you personally? I know it's different for everyone, but just a couple tops. And if you don't, that's fine. But
oh yeah, no, it is absolutely a good question. My very first favorite herb is cistus tea, which is grown in Sardinia, and it's very good for microbes, and it's also helpful with mold. It's believed that it's one of the things that helps people to live so long in that area of the world, and they live very long and healthy lives. There's many reasons for that, but it is believed that cistus tea is one of them. And I liked it because it was more gentle. I didn't have really intense Herx reactions from it. Like in terms of treating the microbes specifically, I also had great success with Japanese knotweed and also cat's claw. And then I did a lot of just supportive things because, as you know, your body gets thrown way out of whack. So you've got to correct everything. You've got to correct your gut. You've got to correct your B vitamins, your D vitamins, your endocrine system, your hormones, your cortisol, adrenaline. So just a lot of supportive therapies to also just rebalance myself and give myself the strength, just give myself like the foundation of strength to endure the battle and the journey.
And yeah, it's a lot and it's amazing. And the fact that you were figuring that out mainly on your own is really impeccable. Thanks for sharing those herbs as well. I'm sure a lot of people now go research them. I guess out of the less putting in your body, but what you're doing externally, like saunas or going into the hyperbaric chambers, or I guess IV is going into your body, but think you're understanding what I'm saying.
Yes.
I'm hoping. What works for you, like baths, Epsom salt, what works for you the most? What do you do every day to, I guess, continue to maintain as well?
Yeah.
Yoga.
Yes, yoga,
Yeah.
which absolutely was a huge part of my story and my process, and we could have a whole separate podcast all about that. But one of the most critical things for me was the sauna. And that played a role in so many different ways. My pain got so excruciating and unrelenting and just to this level where I really had to do something about it because it was unbearable. And the sauna is not an overnight solution, but it was what I needed to like dislodge all of the toxins that had completely saturated my body, to start, kind of wringing myself out like a sponge. And within 3 months, my pain improved significantly. And then of course the sauna is just good when you're going through a Herx. It's really important for detoxing from mold. It's just a good practice in general, like even for healthy people to do saunas here and there. So yeah, that was very difficult because, thankfully I had a meditation practice and I would also just listen to meditations, because sitting there for, an hour, 3 to 5 times a week, or about anywhere from 3 to 5 hours a week in a sauna, just, sweating and you feel awful, you're in terrible.
It is uncomfortable. And I don't think that's talked about enough. Like that was something I heard so many benefits from it. And so I keep looking this way because my sauna is right next to me. But I'm like, my time. But I think that's something that's a lot of these treatments in the moment are not comfortable. And that doesn't mean, and you do really have to listen to your body and what works with your body is what I've learned. And so I think acknowledging to listeners that sometimes in the treatment, and we all know Herx's, it's going to be uncomfortable, but really having that meditation practice, that mantra, if you have people around you telling you, or just whatever you can do to remind yourself this is for a bigger and greater reason. And whether it is listening to that meditation for the couple hours you're in the sauna throughout a week. But I think really having those other tools of, yes, you're gonna be sitting there and questioning things. So don't let that happen. Try take control, put something on in the back, speak to yourself, have that meditation. I think that's really amazing that you really do practice that each time through your journey. I think that's incredible. From there, so where are you now with how long did it take to because you moved to Colorado, and how long have you been there now since you moved back?
Let's see, I think it's been about going on 8 years. And it wasn't oh, 1 second. Come here.
Little doggy, support animal, love the little pup. Oh my goodness. We got a friend on the podcast.
And he's grumpy.
Oh, I love that.
It was a journey, because I treated the Lyme and the other microbial infections, but it turned out that mold was a big player for me, and that was a bit more tricky to figure out. Not only how to get mold out of my life, but the treatment's pretty brutal. But to be honest, treating Lyme and the other infections prior to the mold kind of geared me up for it, so that when I went through that, it was kind of like old hat by that time,
Yeah.
So it took quite a while, and as you had mentioned, lots of trial and error, just really struggling to maintain hope a lot of times. And when you have like the good moments, you get a bit attached to them, and you kind of think, oh, I'm in the clear, I'm out of the woods. And then that would last for a few hours, maybe a few days, and then you'd be plummeting, maybe even worse than you were before. So also just maintaining like hope, and determination. And I think a big part for me was once I got to this level of acceptance, because probably for at least the first year, I was in some kind of like resistance. You don't want to accept really what's going on. And of course, I had been told by lots of internet research and by my doctor that it would be easy, that it would be a quick treatment, and I'd just be like on my way, like on with my life. And that just wasn't the case, So it did take like taking a big step back and just continuing to try things and rotate things. And of course, finding the right doctor was a huge piece.
And so coming with that, I guess for me and for everyone, to summarizing, I guess, what treatments work the best, and would you have done them in a different order? Would you have, if you knew what you knew kind of now, sorry, I just dropped my glass. Would you do it in a different order? How would you approach this in a different way? If you could, if you would, what would, I guess, your different steps be, if so?
Yeah. I think for me, everything worked out the way that it was supposed to. I call them miracles. I had lots of miracles along my journey. And the first was that I started a life of healing and started incorporating healing practices into my life before I started the Lyme treatment. So that kind of geared me up, because it helped me to endure the treatment much better than I would have otherwise. And then, of course, I addressed all of the microbial issues, and it was very difficult because I wasn't getting that much better. Like, I got better, but still was really struggling to just do basic functioning. And that's when I started treating exposure to mold and also intestinal parasites. I would say, everything for me kind of unfolded as it should have. And I was really fortunate to not have like any disastrous events happen in terms of doing things that turned out to just be really, really detrimental to me. I felt like that with everything that I was trying, I was progressing a bit. And, like I did ozone therapy. I did lots of herbs, lots of supportive therapies, just taking buckets of supplements, making sure to eat nutritious foods, drink, healing teas with different medicinal purposes. So I would say for me that I don't necessarily have like any type of regret or wishing anything would have happened differently. I probably, in hindsight, if I could have connected with the doctor who really, really ended up being the game changer for me, I do wish I could have met her sooner. Because who's to say, maybe I could have come around a little bit sooner. And I do wish that I would have started the mold treatment sooner, but at the same time, I probably couldn't have, because as you know, your body can only handle so much treatment. So it was actually pretty good that I got through the microbial stuff before I addressed that, because it rocks your world. But that ended up being such a contributing factor that perhaps if I could have gotten my arms around it sooner, I could have just felt better sooner. Yeah. And I was in a bit denial about it, which I think a lot of people are, because mold is another dirty word.
Extremely common, I would say, that we like to live in denial for, not like, but do live in denial for a little bit. I will say thank you so much for sharing so much of that. I'm going to pass it off back to Rick in a second. But I do also really relate with what you're talking about when it comes to the path of how things have gone through for you and how it works for each person personally. Yes, there's things I wish could have gone better. I'm sure we all do. But I think for yours specifically, it really does seem like it was kind of that meant to be, in the not great possible way, but meant to be in the path of having a not great situation. And so I'll let Rick take back over, and if he has any questions on this, but I really do think it's a beautiful way of looking at it, of it's meant to be miracles. I think that really always that piece of hope, that little flick up, I really think is what a lot of people need to hold on to, remember, and always come back to. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Georgia. It was so lovely to speak with you today.
Of course, you as well.
So, Milena, before you say goodbye,
I was about to say there's more.
have a few things.
I was like, I'm coming back in one more time.
We have to connect the journey. We now have to connect the balance of your journey to where you are now, right? Because you were a young woman who became a communications professional. Unfortunately, found yourself pursuing that career in dirty, toxic New York City, which unfortunately led to your toxic load and caused you to become more chronically ill. But you did develop your communication skill set, and as you got through the journey of your illness, you started to use your communication skill set again. So talk to us a little bit about the types of work that you're doing, not just in your own business, which I do want to build out with you, but also you're doing some work in the Lyme world as well. So why don't you share that with our listeners?
Yeah. So, I had to take about 3 years off of working, unable to work at all. And then I started to be able to take on a few hours here and there. And I was really fortunate to be referred to work with one of the top Lyme organizations that does a lot of work in the advocacy and fundraising realm, and has funded a lot of research and been a pivotal player in a lot of changes to legislation and just overall education and awareness. So I helped them with their website and writing different articles based off of research that's coming out. So it really has been good for me because it helps me to have my finger on the pulse in terms of all of the new incredible advances in different areas of the Lyme landscape. It also just gave me a sense of purpose and helped connect me to fellow Lymies, and just also tapped me into a channel of hope, knowing that there are people out there working tirelessly to, help and support and make changes for Lyme patients. So that was another miracle, another blessing. I've had many blessings on my journey. And let's see, like late 20 or early 2021, I think it was. Yeah, the spring of 2021. I was just very eager to start putting to practice my different yogic studies and skills. And, you know, it had been something I dreamt of doing back in 2017, but had to put the plan on pause. I remember telling the friends that I was collaborating with at the time, I was like, I don't know what's wrong with me, but I can't do this. You know, I'm sick. I'm like, somehow I'm sick. And I couldn't explain to them why or what, but you know, all these years later, as I got a little bit better, just well enough to be able to kind of put some programs together and be able to sit upright at my computer for a bit of time, I just started teaching meditations to friends and family. And we would get together every week. And we did so consistently for about a year and a half. And that was a great thing for me to do because it was very forgiving. Like I could cancel at the last minute if I wasn't feeling well. If I showed up feeling terrible, and they would just be very patient with me and, you know, just be there to support me. And it also helped stimulate my brain because I was kind of refreshing myself on all these different concepts and using them for myself and also to share with this group of people that would meet with me online. So it kind of started happening midway through the pandemic. So it also gave us a wonderful way to gather despite, you know, quarantines and things like that. And through that, I started then teaching yoga to friends and family. And one of my dear friends who I was teaching to happens to be an advocate in the Lyme space and invited me to teach for one of her support groups, a Colorado-based support group. So I got to teach a couple of groups of people. And then that kind of, you know, snowballed. And I always planned on having a yoga business. And I was starting to develop this idea of teaching yoga specifically for people with chronic illness and, you know, even more specifically Lyme disease, because that's like the community that I come from. But I kind of had to get things buttoned up a little quicker because things just started happening. And I actually like had to have a website. I had to start implementing some processes and like scheduling and get some group classes on the schedule because things just kept progressing. So now, you know, I have like a Facebook page and Instagram. I'm connecting with new students all the time. And yeah, like, you know, I've now launched a little online yoga business called Soul Tribe Yoga Collective. Most of my students are dealing with Lyme disease. Most of my students happen to be based on the East Coast just because, you know, that is where there's such a large population, where it's such an issue. But I do work with students nationwide. So I have students in several states, and the yoga is just very, very, very gentle. I've just taken my experience and a lot of what I learned through my own journey, as well as the different studies that I've undertaken to create something that is just very supportive and very healing. And, you know, many of us are not only dealing with the physical symptoms, but we're dealing with a lot of stress and overwhelm. So a lot of my techniques are also designed to just really help people cope with that component of, you know, this battle that we're facing on a daily basis.
It's really beautiful the way you've taken this very challenging set of circumstances that you had to manage, and you're now serving the community in two capacities. One, purely as a communication professional, where you're helping one of the top Lyme disease organizations in the world to communicate with other people that need their help. And then you're also using your communication skills and you're coupling them with your passion for yoga and the experiences that you've had through using yoga to help you both physically and emotionally overcome these challenges to now help other people. And this has really become the very definition of who you are now, somebody who is a healer by using her communication skills in two different arenas.
Absolutely. Yeah, everything really came full circle. And I absolutely love what I'm doing looks like, and I love the people that I'm connecting with, and we all have different circumstances and our stories are unique, but as Georgia had implied earlier, like this journey also connects us, and there's a lot of overlap and a lot of things that we can understand amongst each other because we've actually shared the experience. So it really has come full circle, and I'm just really excited and eager to continue the journey.
And it is really exciting, again, as somebody who's just been blessed to sit on the outside and watch you heal, is that you've also become someone who understood that that being alone only enhances the disease and makes you more vulnerable. And you've also now become someone who is bringing people together and creating a supportive environment, knowing that that's what's necessary to heal. So that's just another beautiful part of your beautiful journey. So yeah, thank you for all of that, all that you're doing, and thank you for sharing all that with us. And with that, you've been kind enough to spend almost 2 hours with us, so we are going to wind down. And again, it's another tribute to how well you're doing, both of you, because you've been both very, very sharp and very, very capable, despite spending a couple of hours together talking about this, right? It really is wonderful that you're both so far along in your journey. And with that, George is going to ask you the final question. The
Yes,
very
I
last
am.
question of this very long and very beautiful podcast.
Agreed. I think I'm actually going to target this a little bit more to a certain kind of community, young women and just women all around. We definitely already live in a world of being shamed, guilted, judged, questioned. If we act certain one way, we're always labeled. And I like how you use those. We already have a couple dirty words working for us. Now we also have mold, Lyme, etc. What would you say to, just someone it's not even women, I guess, but it could be people who are really struggling with the outside world telling them, even when they've got their diagnosis, even when they've come on podcasts like this or really heard that confirmation, how do you not question yourself? And it's a big question, but if you have any little tips that you stand by that help you not let the outside world re-question that trauma or re-trigger, that's my biggest question there. Well, what would you tell your younger self, I guess, even living in New York?
Great question. Many layers to that.
Sorry, it was meant to be the ending one.
I love it. I love it. It is very tough going through this journey, possibly being alone, possibly being surrounded by people who doubt you and criticize and judge you. Even if they have the best intentions, that can still come across. But I think that we need to remember that we know ourselves the best, better than anybody, no matter what anybody else may say. We absolutely know ourselves. And I think that's, one thing that this journey can be. It can be a journey through yourself and getting to know yourself even better. You might discover parts of yourself that you never knew before. And you're actually probably going to have to work through a lot of parts of yourself that you don't like. But as we peel back the layers, we get to our core self, our core beliefs. We know what's best for us. And it can be very, very tricky. But in this day and age, because we've got, tools like Zoom, we've got different organizations doing mentorships and support groups and that sort of thing, find even just one person who can support you right. You don't have to have a ton of people, but if you can find one person who can support you properly and adequately and sincerely, that can really make a huge difference for you. And if it's not someone try to seek them out. I know it's hard. You're exhausted. You might just be lying in a dark room in silence. When you can, go to the internet and go to something like Meetup, or, look into LymeDisease.org or Global Lyme Alliance. There's so many organizations, and just see what they have going on. And just, it might take some trial and error. You might first find some groups that aren't the right match. You might find a mentor who doesn't understand or is not the right fit, but do your best to keep going and see if you can just find one person who can, really have empathy and compassion and understanding, and who pushes you in the right direction and is supportive of your journey. And at the same time, I know it can get exhausting having to educate others, because there's a lot of ignorance out there about these things. And, yes, to some degree, it's not their fault, but everybody needs to try a little harder. If we can all just try a little harder, we go so far. But at the same time, have a little bit of compassion for them as well, even though it can be really hard, because it can be very frustrating and, bewildering with some of the things that people can say and do.
That was a very, very good response to a very big question, and I loved it. Thank you so much for sharing your mind.
So that is the perfect way of ending this podcast, with the perfect question and the perfect answer. So, Georgia, thank you for serving as my co-host on this edition of the Tick Bootcamp podcast. And Milena Pastore, I can't thank you enough for spending so much time and sharing so much of your journey with the good folks here in the community known as Tick Bootcamp.
It was so wonderful to sit down and have this conversation with you. I could do it again. Let's have another one tomorrow.
We'll definitely have to have a follow-up. Maybe we'll make the follow-up a more yoga focused podcast.
That would be so fun.
Beautiful.